Well, thank you, Sue Ellen. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Geraldine. It's such a privilege and an honor to be able to participate in a conversation with you this evening.
Well, the honor is mine entirely.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by congratulating you on this extraordinary novel. This is a novel that's characterized by meticulous research, elegant language, fascinating characters, compelling narrative. I mean, it has it all, right? And it's such an extraordinary accomplishment. And in addition to those qualities, the book moves seamlessly through 3 different historical periods with their own sort of cast of characters. And it's so impressive that you're able to captivate our attention with these sort of interlocking narratives. So I just want to thank you for that as a way of beginning. I'd like to ask you first, as you know, if you would read an excerpt from the novel, just to sort of get us going.
I am going to read, I was telling Valerie, this is my easy character because for most of the characters I did have to do an immense amount of research, so I thought I would give myself a break and write a character that is very closely based on myself in that she is a little nerdy and a little clumsy, and she comes from Australia, and she accidentally found herself with a career in the United States. This character is essential to the story because I knew that this story about the horse would also come into the present because I became fascinated with the science around the skeleton of the horse. So the bit I'm going to read is about the Smithsonian scientist who is in charge of preparing bones for scientific study. Jess, Smithsonian Museum Support Center, Maryland, 2019. Jess was 7 when she dug up the dog. He'd been dead a year. She and her mum had buried him with ceremony under the flowering red gum in the backyard, and they both cried. Her mother wanted to cry again when Jess requested large Tupperware containers for the bones she'd just exhumed. Generally, Jess's mother was the kind of parent who would let her daughter set the house on fire if she thought it could teach something about carbon and oxygen. But she was stricken with a stab of anxiety. Was digging up a beloved pet and macerating its corpse a sign that your child had psychopathic tendencies? Jess tried her best to explain that she dug up Milo because she loved him, and that's why she had to see what his skeleton looked like. Beautiful, as she knew it would be. The swoop of the rib cage, the scoop of the eye sockets. Jess loved the interior architecture of living things. Ribs, the protective embrace of them, how they hold delicate organs in a lifelong hug. Eye sockets. No artisan had ever made a more elegant container for a precious thing. Milo's eyes had been the color of smoky quartz. When Jess touched a finger to the declivities on either side of his delicate skull, she could see those eyes again, the kind gaze of her earliest friend, avid for the next game. She grew up on one of the dense streets of liver brick bungalows that marched westward with Sydney's first growth spurt in the 1900s. Had she lived in a rural place, she might have exercised her fascination on road-killed kangaroos, wombats, or wallabies. But in inner Sydney, she was lucky to find a dead mouse, or perhaps a bird that flew into a plate glass window. Her best specimen was a fruit bat that had been electrocuted. She found it on the nature strip under the power lines. She spent a week articulating it, the papery membrane of the wing unfolding like the pleated bellows of an accordion, the metatarsal bones like human fingers, but lighter, evolved not to hold and grasp, but to fan the air. When she was done, she suspended it from the light fixture in her bedroom ceiling. There, stripped clean of all that could readily decay, she watched it fly forever through endless nights.
Thank you for that. So the book is called Horse, and the through line of the novel is the horse we come to know as Lexington, right? So Lexington, the actual horse, paintings of Lexington, Lexington's skeleton. So I thought I'd begin by asking you to talk a bit about horses and about Lexington in particular. Where does your fascination with or love for horses come from? When did it originate? I'll start with that question, and then secondly, what makes Lexington so special to you?
So I came to horses late. I love all animals. You can ask Luann Johnson from Biodiversity Works. I'm the only person perhaps on the island who ever tried to save a sick skunk. You've got a sick what? But horses, they were something I admired from a distance, but because I like Jess, grew up in the inner city in Sydney, it wasn't part of the ambit claim of my imagination that I could ride a horse or have a horse. But I was at a writer's retreat in Santa Fe in 2011, and my room on this genteelly shabby ranch where this writer's retreat was being held overlooked a corral full of the most beautiful Appaloosas and paint horses. And I was admiring them from a distance. And one of the wranglers said, "You should come on a trail ride." And I said, "I can't ride." And he said, "You can. These horses know their jobs. They won't let you fall." And the next day, we are cantering along the cliff edge in this acacia-scented arroyo, and I was ecstatic. And I came home, and the next week, a young friend came over for dinner, and I was telling her what a wonderful experience this had been. And she looked out the window and said, "You've got a couple of acres here. You could have a horse. In fact, I could give you my horse." There were many questions I should have asked. But instead, I just fenced half the property and turned the tool shed into a stall and started to learn about how you transport a horse, because this horse was not close by. This horse was in Mexico. But this horse was beautiful. And I knew that because this horse had been in an ad for a fast-acting anti-fungal vaginal cream. The horse gallops and the voiceover goes, "Something should be fast." And while I waited to get this horse from Mexico, negotiating with two governments, a slew of veterinarians, figuring out how to route around the intense violence caused by drug cartels on the border at that time, I watched that ad 1,000 times. Anyway, long story short, that was how I started out with horses at the ripe age of 53, which I do not recommend. Start early when you can still bounce. But I became so obsessed with this horse and how to look after this horse and everything to do with this horse that I wasn't getting any writing done. My book I was supposed to be working on was absolutely languishing, and horses are really expensive. It's, they say a boat is a hole in the ocean that you put money in. A horse is a hole in the backyard. Anyway, the red ink was about to overtake the balance sheet because of my non-performance of my actual job. And I then went with Rose Styron, who I just saw, to a lunch at Plymouth Pawtuxet Museum. And across the table from us was a guy from the Smithsonian who had just come from delivering the skeleton of Lexington from an attic in Washington in the Natural History Museum to the Museum of the Horse in Kentucky. And as he told the story of this racehorse, who was the fastest and greatest racehorse of the 19th century, and also the greatest stud sire in American thoroughbred breeding history, and they got to the bit about what happened to this horse during the Civil War, and I'm like, my salad is uneaten. I am leaning forward, and I realize that I've just solved my problem because I can sell this idea to my publishers, and I can keep thinking about horses 24/7, and we're all set.
Wow, that's quite a story. That is great. This is going to be a lot of fun. That's really fascinating. Thank you for that. So I was really interested in the relationship between Jarrett Lewis, who was an enslaved man and an extraordinary horse trainer, the relationship between Jarrett Lewis and Lexington. What makes Jarrett such a remarkable horse trainer? What qualities does he have, do you think, that...
So the real Jarrett we only know of from some very scant records. There is a missing painting that was described as the best painting by this particular artist, Thomas Scott, who's a character in the novel. I said it was his best work. And the title was Lexington being led out by Black Jarrett, his groom. And so I went looking for Jarrett in the historical record, because once you've been with horses, you realize that that is where the intense relationship is. It's not the jockey, it's not the owner, it's not the breeder. It is the person who's there every morning, mucking out the stall, noticing if the horse is well, feeding, brushing, spending time. So that's where the intense relationship and the interspecies communication happens. And so I could find that Jarrett actually was with Lexington during all of his stud career, because he's in the records of the property owner. And this particular property owner started paying his enslaved people right after the Emancipation Proclamation, which was not unheard of, but quite unusual. So he's in the pay records. But everything else about him, I made him a composite of other horse trainers that we do know about, like Ansel Williams, who was he trained the first winner of the Kentucky Derby, a horse named Aristides, who was actually a son of Lexington. So I took the details that we knew about him and a couple of other better documented trainers and gave that to Jarrett. And I also gave Jarrett all my own feelings about my horse.
Right, okay. So I wonder if I want to just maybe put a little pressure on this idea of your feelings about a horse, because one of the things that's so remarkable about the book to me is the way you capture what I would call, I guess, the inner lives of horses, the way that your characters are able to describe a horse's temperament, and then the way that temperament informs the way they are ridden, the way they are painted, and so on. Can you say a little bit more about the feeling and how the feeling becomes knowledge, if you will? So,
I've always had dogs, and when I was a kid, we had cats. And I think that those species are a very easy bond to have, because we're both looking out at the world as predators. We're both looking straight ahead. Horses are entirely different. They're looking all around to see what is coming to eat them next. And so to make that leap across species between a predator and a prey animal, it is very challenging, but when it happens, it is super rewarding. And also, horses are exquisitely sensitive. And I had the incredible privilege to be able to work with my horse at Misty Meadows, where there's a therapeutic riding program. And the children I worked with had autism. And seeing the change when they got on that horse, it was remarkable, and what the horses knew and what they could understand and give. So they really are incredible animals.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. So, as I mentioned, you're able to capture the sort of the inner lives of horses, and then also to capture the biomechanics of their movements, right? And so I felt that I was both sort of inside the lives of horses, but I could actually begin to imagine the visual representations as well. What kind of research was required to be able to capture that kind of specificity?
So the most fun thing was spending time at the Museum Support Center. Because if the Smithsonian's the attic of America, this is the attic's attic. It's where they have everything that's not on display, which is 98% of it. Mm-hmm. It's a huge campus. It just, that they call the corridor the street because it is so extensive. And there's every kind of high-tech lab that you can think of dedicated to art curation or dedicated to DNA sampling or linguistics, or you name it, it's going on there. And if you're in a lab, what's passing by in the corridor is just totally distracting because a triceratops head will go this way. And a 14th century painted Chinese palanquin will go that way. And, it's just incredible. And within this treasure house is the bug room, which is where bones are cleaned, because you can have all the high-tech stuff in the world. We haven't got any better way to clean bones than to get domestic beetles to eat the flesh off them. So I got to spend time in the bug room. So that was one part of getting to know what an osteopreparator does and what they know about bones and what the bones will be used for in scientific study. And then another fun thing is just calling up people and pestering them. So I called a lot of veterinarians, and a couple of them got so interested because there's a bit of a mystery around something that happened to Lexington. I don't want to spoil it, but I wanted to get veterinary opinions about this. And so I was calling vets in Australia and vets in England, and they were getting really excited. And one of them actually went to the Museum of the Horse to take a look at the skeleton with a portable ultrasound. So that was terrific. People are really wonderfully helpful, especially people who have jobs that they're passionate about. So it was something I learned as a journalist, that you can get people to talk about their work, and yeah.
Great. Okay. So you told us about the origin of the book. Can you tell us about the process by which it unfolded? So you were intrigued by Lexington. You had your passion for horses. How did you just determine that you wanted to connect the antebellum story to the contemporary period? How did that process unfold?
Well, I knew I was fascinated by the science, and so I wanted to address that. So I knew there'd be a contemporary strand. What I didn't know was that I would be writing a story not just about a racehorse, but also about race in America, because when I started the research, I had no idea how fundamental the contribution of the black horseman was to the thoroughbred industry, which was huge in the antebellum period, both North and South. It was a national obsession, I think. 30 and 40,000 people would go to the track to watch thoroughbred races at that time, in a much smaller population, mind you. So there were 3 newspapers just devoted to the subject of horse racing, and they had huge circulations. And all of this was built on the plundered labor of enslaved or formerly enslaved, highly skilled, expert horsemen in the South. And so once I realized that, and realized that Lexington's first successes were under the trainership of Harry Lewis, who was an actually existing very famous black trainer of his day, then there's no way to avoid going right there. And so if you're going to go right there in the 19th century, you can't just say, oh, well, that's a story of injustice in the 19th century, and that doesn't have any bearing on our story in the 21st century, because that story, as we know, is not over. Mm-hmm. And so it had to echo and resonate in the present as well.
So I want to sort of follow up on that a bit then. So the novel takes place in sort of three different historical periods. There's the sort of Jared Lewis, Lexington, antebellum period. There's there are the sections that focus on Martha Jackson, the art collector and gallery owner in the 1950s, and then there is the section there are the sections that focus on Jess and Theo in the contemporary period, 2019, 2021, mm-hmm. right? 2019-20. That must be really challenging, I imagine, to weave and move from different historical periods back and forth. I mean, I describe them as if they're sort of chunks, but you braid them so beautifully. Could you talk about the excitement and the challenges of working in that way?
Yeah, more like the terror and the
okay.
Because you start and you know that you have these stories that you want to tell, but it was very unclear to me how they were going to connect. And I was still struggling with that 5 years into the project, and it was only after doing an immense amount of work that it became clear to me how they would intersect with each other. Mm-hmm. I should say, the Martha Jackson element came from when I went to the Smithsonian to research the history of the skeleton at the Smithsonian. They said, there's a painting of Lexington in the National Gallery of Art. Would you like to see it? And it wasn't on display. It was in a study area. So I went to see the painting, and I said, did it come with the skeleton in the same bequest? And they said, oh, no, it came from a bequest from Martha Jackson, who's this famous feminist gallerist and early supporter of Jackson Pollock and de Kooning and Bridget Riley, and who coined the term op art. And she was a champion of the most avant-garde movements of the post-World War II period. And in her bequest, everything she gave to the Smithsonian was edgy contemporary art, except for this one traditional oil portrait of Lexington painted in the 19th century. Why did she have that? Mm-hmm. I was so intrigued by the question. And then, I didn't think Lexington was going to connect to Jackson Pollock. But there you are, it did.
Right. So, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the nature of the connections among the three different plot lines. So Lexington is a through line, for sure. And Lexington in all these different forms. But how else do you see the stories as connected?
It connects mainly through the art story. Mm-hmm. So this horse was such a celebrity. He was painted many times, and there were two principal equine portrait artists. The most famous is Troy, but Troy's pupil, Thomas Scott, was rediscovered quite by accident when a physical plant maintenance guy from the University of Kentucky noticed a picture of a horse that was in the neighbor's throw-out pile mm-hmm. on the curb. So Scott was rediscovered. Scott painted Lexington many times and painted the Black Horseman. And then there's the whole discussion of how these portraits of the Black Horseman are unusual because they are so individualized, and they are so, the horsemen are given individual authority in a way that is pretty uncommon, where generally speaking, if a black figure is included in British equestrian art, it is to be a kind of exotic detail or to aggrandize the master. This seemed very different, that these horse artists, I think, appreciated the expertise and skill of these men and portrayed them as real individuals in the portraits. So that interested me, and I borrowed from, the scholarship of a real art historian who had looked into this, and gave that to my character Theo, who's an art historian. And,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's really through the paintings that I was able to connect the stories, because you see Scott painting them, and then you have to follow what happens to the paintings through time. And Scott was a very interesting guy who had started out to be a doctor, but didn't have the money to complete his training, so he became a pharmacist. And then, because he loved horse racing so much, had a career as an itinerant painter. And then during the Civil War, he was with the Kentucky Volunteer Unit on the Union side, and he was the medic of that unit. So he had a very interesting Civil War story as well. So he's a character.
Okay. So I wonder if we could talk for a bit about the contemporary plot, the plot that features Theo and Jess. You introduced our members of the audience to Jess, who is the scientist, the bone preparator, the osteoparator at the Smithsonian. Theo is a Nigerian-American graduate student, art history graduate student, who's working on a project that has to do with representation of black figures in British art. And because of this, becomes interested in equestrian art. And so, and the two of them have this sort of bond. It's really fascinating to me to see how Lexington is viewed through the eyes of an art historian on the one hand and the eyes of a scientist on the other, and how their perspectives interact in that sort of plot sequence. What do you think Theo and Jess learn through their interaction with the Lexington legacy, the Lexington figure? What do you think they discover about each other, about themselves through that interaction?
I let Jess be as kind of blundering and awkward as I am about Theo's experience, how he moves through the world. And they're drawn together by this mutual interest. It's not clear if there's any future to this relationship or not, but she is learning a tremendous amount, but she still makes all the same dumb, witless mistakes that you make through a lack of experience living in a black skin in this society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what do you think he's learning?
I think he's learning, he finds her very odd mm-hmm. and a bit hard to take at times. But he's attracted to her because she reminds him of the one time in his life when he was entirely loved and happy, which was when his diplomat parents had a posting in Australia. So he has a nostalgic connection to his childhood through her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. One of the things that you, it's like when I think about that relationship between art and science in that relationship, it reminds me of the technique that you use so beautifully, which is to anchor the narrative in facts, right? In the actual story of a horse who existed, a thoroughbred who existed. In the figure of Thomas Scott, who actually existed, the figure of Martha Jackson actually existed, facts about the Smithsonian and so on. So the novel is anchored in facts, but you rely so powerfully on the imagination to flesh out the rest of the story where the facts are
Run
inadequate.
out.
Right,
Run
exactly.
out, yeah.
And I know this is something that you've done in your work elsewhere. I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about the impact and the implication of that relationship between fact and the imagination, or history and the imagination. What kind of work that does for you as an artist?
I really love to find these stories that are quite unlikely, but they happened. And, as Mark Twain brilliantly observed, fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. Truth isn't. And I can tell you that the weirdest things in this book are the true things. So if you scaffold the work on fact, and you can build a strong enough foundation, then when the line of fact gets faint and then finally fades, there's T.S. Eliot come to visit us. This is apparently the resident literary cat. So when the line of fact frays, then I can weave a few strands of imagination together, and if I've got the scaffolding in place strongly enough, I'm mixing my metaphors in a completely shocking way here. I can haul you along with me. I can make you believe in it. I can build this edifice that is, that will stand up in your imagination. So that's why I think it's really important to do the work as best you can to try and not make stupid blunders, like don't have the train stop in Fitchburg 100 years before there was a station in Fitchburg. Don't use a word that wouldn't have been used in that century. And I really try to get those details right so that when I start to make it up, I've laid the foundation strongly enough.
One of the things, it's funny, when you read the excerpt at the start of our conversation, I think you used the word articulation, right? Is that right? Yeah. And it reminded me of how careful you are with your use of language. Especially in, I would say, in the first sort of 100 pages or so, I found myself just sort of meditating over your word choice, because I felt that was one way in which you were sort of locating us in different historical moments, was accustoming us to the vocabulary of the period and also the vocabulary of a particular profession, the vocabulary of the racers or the jockeys, or the vocabulary of the scientists, or the vocabulary of the painters. You do that so beautifully. I mean, your love of language is just breathtaking. So, it was a lot of fun to do to research the antebellum racing scene, because we've all got, I hope we've all got a lot of reservations about racing in the present time because of the equine abuse that is frankly going on, with 22 horses dying every week on the track. It does not have to be that way. But there's such great vocabulary. And discovering these things is what gets me out of bed in the morning. But winning hands down, we all use that expression, right? That means that the jockey didn't have to lift his whip, or he won hands down. Shoe-in is when the jockeys conspire in a fixed race to shoe one jockey in. And things like that. Right. So, and I just find that super enjoyable. Oh, and I, as a reader, I think we can sense your pleasure and joy in it. I mean, I feel like you're teaching us but it's not heavy-handed at all. It's very elegant. And
Mind you, I was reading the other night and I thought, oh my God, that's a mistake. I'm going to have to change that in the next edition because I have Jarrett throwing out a flake of hay. There's no way there would have been a flake because they didn't have a mechanical binder.
Interesting. Okay. I wouldn't have caught that. This novel then also challenges you to write about, as you said, a character like Jess, with whom you have quite a lot in common, as well as a range of characters with whom you have little to nothing in common, correct? The antebellum enslaved characters, for one, and even Theo, Nigerian-American graduate student in the present. Now, we all appreciate that artists of all stripes have to imagine themselves into worlds and perspectives that are not their own as part of the creative process. That goes without saying. But in recent years, there's been a fair amount of controversy around writers or artists who attempt to represent worlds that are quite different from their own, especially in terms of race and ethnicity. How do you respond to challenges of that nature if and when they come your way, given the range of perspectives that you approach in a book like this one?
To be honest, there was a point where I thought, I can't do this. I thought, you're going to walk into a threshing machine and it's too much responsibility. But then I thought a little bit more about the cowardice implicit in that. And, having learned about the contribution of these incredibly skilled men, and they were all men, of course, at that time, I just felt like we should know about them. We should know how much wealth they created for this, barbaric system. And we should know there's a wonderful line in your fantastic book about Toni Morrison where you talk about the story of race doesn't only have to be about blame and victimization. And one of the things that I loved about getting to know these men was that within the constraints of this incredibly brutal system, there was such resilience, and there was such resourcefulness, and passion, and love, and a whole full life. And I thought, I'm going to try, I'm going to do my best, I'm going to do the work, I'm going to do the research, I'm going to talk to as many people I can, and try and get it right. And if I don't, I'm sure I'll hear about it. So.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you did. So I'm about to open up the conversation for questions from members of the audience, but before I do that, Geraldine, would you read one other excerpt from the book of your choosing, and then we'll open it up to members of the audience.
I might just introduce Jarrett.
Okay.
Warfield's Jarrett, The Meadows, Lexington, Kentucky, 1850. She was no one's notion of an easy mare, not mean but nervous, which could come to the same thing if you didn't account for it. Jarrett knew how to approach her, steady and deliberate. You shouldn't hesitate or show uncertainty, but if you were too high-handed, she'd make you pay. She could snake around and have a piece of your arm or kick out and crack a shin. Dr. Elisha Warfield had bred her himself and named her for his daughter-in-law, Alice Carneal. There were jokes around the barn about what he meant by that and what he might have been trying to say to his son. But Alice Carneal never hurt Jarrett. No horse ever had. Look at him, Dr. Warfield would say, lifting one of Jarrett's long, skinny arms. He's half colt himself. Jarrett took it as a compliment. For what would be the use in taking it otherwise? And it was true. He had a feel for horses, deep in the grain. The first bed he could remember was in a horse stall. He shared straw with the two geldings in the carriage house, while his mother slept in the mansion, nursemaid to the mistress's infant. Jarrett barely saw her. His first language had been the subtle gestures and sounds of horses. He'd been slow to master human speech, but he could interpret the horses, their moods, their alliances, their simple wants, their many fears. He came to believe that horses lived with a world of fear, and when you grasped that, you had a clear idea how to be with them.
Thank you. So I think now we can open up the floor for questions from members of the audience. If you would if you would raise your hand, and then they'll bring a mic to you. If you could identify yourself and go ahead and ask your question, that would be great.
Knocked them all into a stupor.
I love your work, and I can't wait to read this book. But it is curious to me that during this antebellum period, as you're describing, I think that everyone that worked with horses was of African descent. And to look at what has happened, in our time, it's the polar opposite of that. And I just wonder how if you're able to address that at all in the story.
So, actually, it wasn't everybody, because it was actually much more integrated than you would imagine. Black and white jockeys were equally successful, equally celebrated, equally given the best mounts depending on their skills. There were white trainers and black trainers. So it was a little bit more mixed, but you are absolutely 100% correct. The most appalling backlash happened after Reconstruction, when all the black jockeys were forced off the track, often at the cost of their lives, because the white jockeys ganged up to make it unsafe for them to ride. And some of those men, the luckier ones, went abroad and had careers abroad very successfully, and others died penniless because they'd been pushed out of their occupation. And it's only now beginning to return. But when you think about the first Kentucky Derby, I think 19 of the jockeys were black. Hi, T.S. And as I said before, the winner was a son of Lexington, trained by a black trainer and ridden by a black jockey. And yet, how infrequent is it to see black trainers and black jockeys, today? So it was, like many things that happened after Reconstruction, a tremendous racist backlash, and it affected the thoroughbred industry incredibly.
Thanks. Hi. I just had a question more about your process of writing historical fiction, because there's so much research that you did, and you researched for years and years. And I'm wondering about the point when you sit down to write, and when you say, okay, I have to just stop, or at least pause, and I have to just start getting this down. And what happens with you in your brain when that point comes, and how does that feel, and when do you know that it's time?
Well, it doesn't go that way, because I start writing straight away, because I want the story to tell me what I need to know. Because I think if you do all the research first, you'll discover a lot of fascinating things. You're going to cram them in there, whether the story needs it or not. So I find it works best for me to just have enough to get started. And then immediately you'll find out that you need to know something. And then I'll go and find it out, and then I'll come back and write that bit and keep going until I need to know something else. So it's like that.
I love the book. You briefly made a reference in your research in the book to a rather unsavory side of the horse industry, whether it's show horse or racing, in terms of the pressure on owners and veterinarians to return horses to the track and to the show ring as soon as possible, even when they weren't fit and ready. I wonder if you could just comment a little bit further on that.
Yeah, so it's about the malpractice that is unfortunately very common. I'm not so familiar with the show scene, but definitely in thoroughbred racing, there is a tremendous overuse of bute to mask pain in horses. And there's something, I don't understand how this is even possible, but they use Lasix, which is a diuretic in this country. It's banned everywhere else in the world. It just makes the horse lighter, but it's really bad for their metabolism and has all kinds of ill effects. So I really think, we're so overdue for a reckoning on the treatment of equines. And the thing that I think every day, because my horse has a paddock mate, my neighbor's horse, who's an off-the-track racehorse. My neighbor got this horse when the horse was 5. He is now 33 years old.
Wow.
He's still sound. He still loves to go out on trail rides. He even loves to jump. If he sees a line of jumps, you can't stop him.
That's amazing.
And it is amazing, but it just points out what a tragic waste goes on, because a lot of these horses, if they don't make it, they can't be retrained for something else. Many of them are just thrown away at the age of 5, when most good horses, you shouldn't even be riding them till they're 5, much less riding them to death. So I think there's a lot of work to be done.
So the book has a very, very unusual name. Did you and your editor have much of a discussion about using that name?
Well, at least you can remember it, right? I once stood behind somebody asking a bookseller for something like 10 parts of pleasure. And I wanted to say 9 parts of desire. They didn't want me to call it horse, actually. There was some controversy about it. Was the name book already taken? If you read this, you will understand why it's called that. There is a reason for this name, but the publisher said, all right, here's the deal. You can keep your crappy title, but you can't have a picture of a horse on the cover. If you want a picture of a horse on the cover, you have to get another title. So you see what my choice was, because I felt very strongly, because of something that happened with the skeleton, and that's why it's called that. So, and also you can remember it.
I'd just like to follow up your questioning. I think a lot of good writers suffer from a lack of editing. Do you have an editor that you work closely with and have spent many years with?
I'm lucky. I have a very lovely editor, but he doesn't see anything until I've gone to my in-house, the friends I rely on. And one of them is an Australian friend who's actually in the film industry, but he has such insight into character and structure and pace from his film work. And so he reads absolutely everything, and some of my best ideas come from him. So it doesn't get out the door and of course my beloved husband was my best editor and my harshest. we'd have some very testy dinners after he. But he was always right, and he was particularly good at. We were together for so long that he knew all my bad habits and all my tics. And so if I ever used the word desiccated or gnarled, he would scratch it. So I don't know how I'll get on without him. So yeah, he edited the first half of this book.
How long did it take you to do this project? And is it the usual time frame that it takes you to do most of your projects? And also, how do you actually keep track of all of the data and all of the research that you do so that you can find it when you're writing?
So it took me 7 years. But that's long, and part of it was because this catastrophic grief bomb went off in the middle of it when my husband died suddenly. And that was a year I could not get my brain to do anything. And then I started this book in 2016, and we all know what happened in 2016. The jackhammer outside the window of Donald Trump, and what's he doing today? Total distraction, unproductive, because it wasn't like I went and chained myself to a detention center or did anything productive, but doom scrolling, a lot of doom scrolling. So I couldn't finish the book until Biden was inaugurated.
I'm really honored to be here.
I'm sorry.
No. We've got dueling microphones.
Thank you for the gift of this book, and I'm sorry for your loss, but thank you for sharing all this with us. You mentioned that your intimacy or love of horses is relatively recent in your life. What about the art history part?
Oh, I was an art history major in college, so my period was mannerism to moderns, and I loved it. And I was a double major, actually, art history and government, because I thought those would be great preparation to be a newspaper reporter. And so I graduated, and I was incredibly well informed in the uses of tempera and Quattrocento Italian wall painting, and the importance of the subconscious in the work of Kandinsky and Clay, and classical political theory from Plato to Hobbes. And I did get hired by the newspaper. They sent me to the sports department to cover the races. So only now, all those many years later, have those two things combined in a productive manner.
Well, I just was saying I'm very honored to be here. I just have recently read The People of the Book and Caleb's Crossing, and I bought March today at the book sale.
Oh.
But one of the things that fascinates me is the diversity of the subjects that you write about, and how each one of them is so particular and special. And I'm wondering curious to know how these things get born and how different they are. I'm really impressed. Beautiful work.
I think it comes from being a newspaper reporter where it's a different story every day, and and also being a real curious bugger. I really love to find out about other people's business and how they do their work and how they get through their day, and just being incredibly curious. And so the ideas seem to come quite haphazardly. A couple of times it's been something I've overheard, like with Horse. And with people of the book, it was a conversation in a bar in Sarajevo about the fate of the Sarajevo Haggadah, and or just on a hike and seeing a sign that said Plague Village and thinking, gee, not many places try to attract visitors by putting up a sign saying Plague Village. Yeah, so the ideas are various, and luckily they always come at an opportune moment.
Are you working on something new?
I just finished something, actually. So the one thing that happened to me was after getting through the terrible year and all the death bureaucracy that happens, I actually took some advice that came to me indirectly from Justice Ginsburg, who had told a friend who was experiencing loss, do your work. It might not be your best work, but it'll be good work, and it will be what saves you. So she said that to Nina Totenberg, and so finally I got back to work, and now I'm working like a maniac because that is what's working for me to get through this loss.
I read your interview in the Times by the book, and you talked about getting to Harvard and being appalled at how few students had actually read a Shakespeare play. And so, since we're talking about books, and lots of books are being written and sold, what do we do about what's happening with readership among students?
So these kids were unbelievably accomplished, bright kiddos, as you can imagine. And it was their high schools had let them down. The high schools are thinking that it's too challenging, which is absurd. I went to a lower middle class Catholic girls' school in Sydney, and we started in on Shakespeare. I think I was 12, and we read at least one play a year. And what a gift, and these kids were lamenting it. They were saying, that they wished they have studied it. So, it's not on them. They're ready and willing. We have to stop underestimating them.
Are there any other questions? I think we have time for one more. If not, then Sue
Thank
Ellen?
you, and thank you.
Thank you.